thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry for being late. I hope you won't mind if I deliver this talk sitting down, because I managed unheroically to pull a muscle while playing football with my son, who is aged 8. So my chances of playing for Manchester United have been put on hold for the moment. When a professor at Harvard chaired my book launch there in the spring, he said to his students, if what you're looking for is a slim volume with easy explanations of the situation in Pakistan and simple solutions for US strategy, then this book is not for you, he said. Which it isn't, as you can probably tell from the size and the weight. My researches in Pakistan have been taking place on and off now since 1988, when I went out there as a journalist for the London Times, covering then the Mujahideen war against the Soviets and their communist allies in Afghanistan. And it's not, of course, an original point to make, but the Haqqani network, which has been so much in the news recently as our enemies, was, of course, in those days, our ally, and was praised to the skies by many of my Western journalistic colleagues based in Pakistan as the best of all the freedom fighters in terms of courage and ability and so forth and so on. A great example of the fact, if I say it myself as a former journalist speaking in circumstances with a journalistic link, not to believe everything you read in the papers. Good. Now, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. A common approach to countries like Pakistan is perhaps an extreme case, has been, on the one hand, to say that these countries are indeed, in an apocalyptic state, are in imminent danger of collapse, with all the horrors that will come out of that, both for them and in terms of terrorist threats to us. But on the other hand, there are strong forces of democracy in Pakistan and progress in other places that we must support. My own analysis, whether you would call it more optimistic or more pessimistic, is, I suppose, very much a matter of taste. On the one hand, I actually see Pakistan as considerably more stable in a weird way, or at least more resilient in the face of Islamist revolution and disintegration than most analyses have had it. On the other hand, I see the roots of this resilience as lying in many of the same factors that present extremely strong obstacles to progress for Pakistan. Economic progress, social progress, and political progress. Under the, what you might call the froth and spray of day-to-day political events in Pakistan, you can, to a diminishing extent, but still to a very great extent in certain parts of the country, see an almost medieval situation in which the caste, if you like, at the top of politics changes, sometimes quite rapidly, though often actually not very rapidly, if one remembers the fact that the leading political families which dominate Pakistan today are the same, although of course they've lost certain members, as they were when I was out there as a journalist almost 25 years ago. The other institution, of course, which changes relatively little over time is the military. Equally important are the underlying structures of Pakistani political society, which basically revolve around the extraction of patronage from the state. We would use the word corruption, and fairly enough. But it's important to note that a great part of this corruption that's extracted from the state is then distributed to followers. And the key reason for that, of course, is not just natural bonds of kinship, but that if you are a politician and you get your hands on state patronage and you do not distribute it to your kinsfolk and followers, well, you won't have any followers. You will retain, of course, relatives, but even your relatives won't support you anymore because there is always cousin somebody or uncle somebody waiting to take your place if you demonstrate either that you're too weak to extract the patronage or you're too greedy to distribute it. The networks or factions which exploit this kinship are in turn largely, though by no means exclusively, based on networks of kinship. And kinship in Pakistan, as in the rest of South Asia, is the single most important dynamic in society, which is not to say that it's monolithic. It differs enormously from one part of Pakistan to another. But it's fair to say that with the partial exception of Karachi, there is no area of Pakistan where kinship is irrelevant politically, and there are some areas where it is the determining factor. These networks of kinship, of patronage, the distribution of patronage, provide the system with much of its resilience in the face of revolution. The political families in the countryside, the feudals as they've been called, although I have to say as a historian this is a phrase that makes me wince because they bear some resemblance to tribal chieftains in parts of Europe in the past. They bear very little resemblance actually to what we think of as the classic European feudals of the Middle Ages. But anyway, the people who are called in Pakistan feudals have still an immense grip on much of the countryside through their wealth, but also because of the way in which they can use that wealth to gain or consolidate leadership of local kinship groups. Now, the relationship between patronage and kinship explains something which, for me at least, was extremely surprising when I first came across it. And my book spends a good deal of its time trying to understand and explain why, which is that the Gini coefficient rating of Pakistan, the Gini coefficient which, I warn you, if anyone asks me in a question to tell you how it works, the microphone will or rather my hearing aid will go off immediately. And if necessary, I will disappear to the lavatory and then out of the back window because I haven't got a clue how it works. As with so much in these areas, we have to take it on faith. And of course, we know that we can take such ratings designed by economists on faith, don't we? Well, anyway, I have to take it on faith. The point being that the Gini coefficient measures social inequality. And the remarkable thing is that Pakistan's rating is astonishingly low, far below India's, far below America's, and a good many other countries as well. Now, the reason for that is twofold. The first is, obviously, that Pakistan just doesn't produce the kind of things which make enormous fortunes in the world today. If you want to make really big fortunes in the world today, outside the great metropolises of the world, you have to either dig stuff out of the ground, like the Arabs or the Russians or some others, raw materials that the metropolises of the world want and need and will pay for, or you have to, like the Chinese and others, make things, or the Thais, make things that people want. The Pakistanis don't do either. You don't make great fortunes out of cotton, which is copper, yes, but not very much of it. So, that's the first reason. But the second reason is this, that in Pakistan, as in South Asia, for by far the greater part of its history, if you want to make a fortune, you make it from the state. You make it from state service. That was the historical pattern in South Asia. You serve the state, or the king, or the prince, or whatever, and he then rewards you with property, which you can then distribute to your followers. If you're raising a small army, or for him, then you distribute it to your armed followers. Once again, though, the point is that to get your hands on the patronage in the first place, you have to bring followers to the table. To keep the followers, you have to distribute the patronage to them. Therefore, albeit of course in a steeply diminishing fashion, a surprising amount of this stuff that's extracted from the state gets distributed downwards in society. And a certain amount gets distributed remarkably far down in society. Now, this is breaking down in certain areas as part of business of the transformation of society. But no aspiring politician in the countryside, if he wants to keep prestige in his own village, can ignore the tradition in many parts of the country of basically giving village feasts to celebrate happy events. The birth of a son going to university, the achievement of a job, the marriage of a daughter, and so forth. And given that in every village you have competing big families and big names, an awful lot of poor people can live for a surprising part of the year off these free village feasts. You see the kids going away with, if they don't have any pots to put it in, with the rice actually in the tails of their shirts. Very medieval, you could say. And so you extract, you distribute. Good for the resilience of the existing system. Absolutely terrible, of course, for the state's ability to conduct development, to raise money in the first place. Now, the most important aspect of the weakness of the Pakistani state from this point of view. Well, first, let me say something about the army. Among the factors, of course, which give resilience to the existing system, while on the other hand undermining it, is the Pakistani army. In the last resort, the army has demonstrated its willingness and capacity to shoot down rebels against Pakistan. There was some question about that with regard to the Pakistani Taliban before 2009, but it's been answered. They will fight to defend the Pakistani state. They have to, because it's often said in Pakistan, in the Pakistani military, echoing, though they don't realize it, something that Voltaire, of course, said about Prussia, that Pakistan is not a state with an army, but an army with a state. And within the military, they say, no army, no Pakistan. But the sensible people within the military also realize that no Pakistan, no army. In other words, they have to maintain and defend this state. That doesn't mean, of course, something I'll come to a bit later, that they're going to do what we want with regard to the Afghan Taliban. But once they saw the Pakistani Taliban emerging as a real threat to the Pakistani state, they did start fighting against them pretty hard and pretty ruthlessly, as I witnessed in certain parts of the country.